In the rolling hills of Lancaster County, an unlikely miracle is about to unfold when 67-year-old Amish farmer Nathan Yoder walks into Miller's auction house with his last dollar crumpled in his weathered hand. He's not looking for salvation. He's simply trying to bring a smile to 4-year-old Emma's face. The orphaned niece he's taken in has known too much sorrow for someone so young, and Nathan believes that broken-down Wagon might spark a little joy in her world. What he doesn't know is that this seemingly worthless piece of wood and metal holds secrets that have been waiting decades to surface. Hidden beneath layers of paint and rust lies a mystery that will connect them to a forgotten piece of their family's past, restore their faith in community, and prove that sometimes God's greatest blessings come disguised as junk. But what could possibly be hidden inside an old wagon that would change their lives forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog hung low over Nathan Yoder's 80-acre farm, like a whispered prayer, softening the edges of a world that had grown too sharp for his liking. From his kitchen window, he watched the sun struggle through the mist, casting long shadows across fields that had fed his family for 4 generations. The irony wasn't lost on him that those same fields might soon feed strangers. Assuming the bank found a buyer willing to work land that came with more debt than topsoil. Nathan's weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, one of the few pieces of his late wife Sarah's china he hadn't sold. The coffee had grown cold an hour ago, but he held onto the warmth of memory more than the drink itself. 43 years of marriage, and still he reached for 2 cups every morning before remembering. Some habits died harder than hope. A soft shuffling from the back bedroom reminded him he wasn't entirely alone anymore. Emma had been with him for 3 months now, ever since the accident that took his nephew David and David's wife Rachel. 3 months of watching a 4-year-old girl navigate grief that would challenge grown men. 3 months of his own clumsy attempts to father a child when he'd never had children of his own, a sorrow that Sarah had carried to her grave 2 years prior. The family Bible sat open on the kitchen table, its leather binding cracked with age and use. Several pages had gone missing over the years, torn out during family disputes, lost to time, or simply worn away by generations of searching fingers. Like everything else in Nathan's life lately, it felt incomplete. He'd been reading the same passage for weeks, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. The words felt hollow some mornings, but today he clung to them with the desperation of a drowning man clutching driftwood. The sound of bare feet on hardwood floors announced Emma's arrival before she appeared in the doorway. Her dark hair hung in tangles around shoulders that seemed too small to carry such enormous sadness. She wore one of the simple dresses that Ruth Miller had sewn for her, plain blue fabric that made her green eyes seem even larger in her pale face. Those eyes had seen too much for someone who should still believe in fairy tales and happy endings. "Good morning, little one," Nathan said softly, setting down his cold coffee. Emma nodded, but didn't speak. She rarely spoke these days, offering only nods and gestures, and the occasional whispered word when absolutely necessary. The grief counselor in town, an Englisher woman with kind eyes and expensive shoes, had explained that this was normal for children who'd experienced trauma. Selective mutism, she'd called it, as if giving it a name made it easier to bear. Nathan prepared Emma's breakfast with the careful attention he once gave to newborn calves. Oatmeal with a drizzle of honey from his own hives, fresh milk still warm from Martha, his aging Holstein, and a slice of bread from the loaf Ruth Miller had brought yesterday. Ruth had been bringing food regularly since Emma's arrival, claiming she simply had too much for one person. Nathan suspected it had more to do with kindness than abundance, but he accepted the help with the grateful humility of a man who'd learned that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. As Emma ate, in silence, Nathan studied her face for signs of the girl she'd been before the accident. David had shown him pictures. Emma laughing on a tire swing, Emma covered in flour while helping her mother bake, Emma chasing chickens around their small farm in Ohio. That vibrant child seemed buried beneath layers of sorrow so deep that Nathan sometimes wondered if she'd ever find her way back to the surface. The clip-clop of horse hooves on gravel announced the arrival of Bishop Samuel Stoltzfus, whose unexpected visits had become a source of gentle anxiety for Nathan. Samuel was a good man, firm in his faith and fair in his judgment, but he carried the weight of community leadership like a yoke across his shoulders. Nathan suspected today's visit had less to do with pastoral care and more to do with the rumors that had been circulating about Nathan's financial difficulties. "Nathan, my friend," Samuel called from the porch, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Might I have a word?" Nathan glanced at Emma, who had stopped eating and fixed her attention on the bishop through the window. Fear flickered across her features, the look of a child who'd learned that official visits often preceded life-changing announcements. "Finish your breakfast," Nathan told her gently. "Bishop Samuel just wants to talk with me." He stepped onto the porch where Samuel waited, his black hat perfectly positioned despite the morning breeze. Samuel's beard, more silver than black now, framed a face that had weathered countless difficult conversations with grace and wisdom. "I've been hearing troubling things," Samuel began without preamble, "about the bank, about deadlines." He paused, studying Nathan's face with the practiced eye of a shepherd who knew his flock. "About desperate decisions." Nathan felt heat rise in his cheeks. In a community where privacy was respected but secrets were rare, his financial struggles had apparently become common knowledge. "The Lord provides," he said, falling back on faith when facts felt too heavy. "Indeed he does," Samuel agreed. "But sometimes he provides through the wisdom to make sound choices and the humility to accept help." He gestured toward the fields that stretched toward the horizon. "This land has been in your family for generations. Your great-grandfather Jacob cleared these fields with his own hands. Your grandfather built that barn with help from neighbors who believed in community. Your father expanded the house when he married your mother, and you and Sarah turned this into one of the finest farms in the county." The history lesson felt like a weight on Nathan's chest. Each generation had built something greater than what they'd inherited, but Nathan faced the possibility of being the one who lost it all. "Things change," he said simply. "They do," Samuel acknowledged. "Children die too young, wives are taken from husbands, crops fail, markets shift, but faith remains constant and community endures." He paused, watching Emma through the kitchen window. "That little girl has lost enough. She doesn't need to lose the only home she has left." Nathan's jaw tightened. "What would you have me do, Samuel? The bank wants their money. I've sold everything I can sell. The harvest won't come in time to make a difference, and even if it did, it wouldn't be enough." "I'd have you remember that you're not alone in this fight," Samuel replied. "The community has been talking. There are those who would help if you'd let them. Pride, that ancient enemy of practical men, reared its head. Nathan had been raised to work hard, pay his debts and stand on his own 2 feet. Accepting charity felt like admitting failure, like proving that he wasn't worthy of the legacy his forefathers had built. "I appreciate the thought," Nathan said carefully, "but I'll find another way." Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly, a sign that his patience was wearing thin. "And what way is that? I heard you plan to attend Miller's auction today, looking to buy something with money you don't have?" Nathan glanced back at Emma, who had finished her breakfast and was now drawing pictures on a piece of paper with a stub of pencil. Her artwork had become more elaborate lately, complex scenes of houses and families and animals that spoke to a longing for normalcy that broke his heart. "Sometimes a man has to make choices that don't make sense to anyone else," Nathan said, finally. "Sometimes the heart knows things the mind hasn't figured out yet." Samuel followed his gaze to Emma. "Ah," he said softly, understanding dawning in his expression. "You're not going to buy something. You're going to buy hope." "Maybe," Nathan admitted, "or maybe I'm just a foolish old man who doesn't know when to quit." "In my experience," Samuel said, his tone gentling, "the two often amount to the same thing." He placed a hand on Nathan's shoulder. "But be careful, my friend. Hope without wisdom can lead to greater heartbreak than despair with clarity." After Samuel left, Nathan returned to the kitchen where Emma had finished her drawing. She held it up for his inspection. A picture of a man and a little girl standing beside what looked like a wagon. The wagon was larger than life, decorated with flowers and pulled by a horse that seemed to be smiling. Above it all, she'd drawn a sun with rays that looked almost like reaching hands. "That's beautiful," Nathan said, meaning it. "Is that us?" Emma nodded, then pointed to the wagon and looked at him with questioning eyes. "You want to see some wagons today?" he asked. Another nod, this one more enthusiastic. Nathan felt something loosen in his chest, the first hint of lightness he'd experienced in months. Maybe Samuel was right. Maybe he was trying to buy hope. But as he looked at Emma's drawing, at the joy she'd managed to capture in crayon and imagination, he decided that hope might be worth his last dollar. The Millers' auction house sat on the edge of town like a repository of dreams and disappointments. Every Saturday, folks from 3 counties gathered to bid on the remnants of other people's lives: furniture from estate sales, tools from failed businesses, livestock from struggling farms. Nathan had been attending these auctions for 30 years, sometimes as a buyer but more often as a curious observer of human nature. Today felt different. Today he was walking in with his last dollar and the weight of Emma's expectations. As they climbed the steps to the auction house, Emma's small hand found his, and Nathan felt the crushing responsibility of being someone's entire world. Tom Miller, the auctioneer, greeted them with the enthusiastic warmth of a man who made his living from other people's enthusiasm. "Nathan, good to see you, and this must be young Emma I've been hearing about." Emma pressed closer to Nathan's side, but didn't hide behind him, a small sign of progress that filled him with disproportionate pride. "We're just looking today," Nathan said, which was both true and completely false. "Well, look all you want," Tom replied. "We've got some interesting pieces today. Found an old wagon out in the Hochstetler barn that's been sitting there for probably 50 years. Needs work, but it's got character." Nathan's attention sharpened. "A wagon?" "Come see for yourself," Tom said, leading them toward the back of the building. The wagon sat in a corner like a forgotten prayer, its wooden sides weathered grey and its metal fittings rusted to the color of dried blood. One wheel tilted at an awkward angle, and the wagon bed was filled with decades of accumulated debris, old newspapers, bird nests, and what looked like the remains of several small animal homes. But Emma saw something different. Her eyes lit up as she approached the wagon, her hands tracing the carved wooden sides with the reverence of an archaeologist discovering treasure. She looked up at Nathan with an expression of pure longing, and in that moment he knew that his last dollar had already found its purpose. "How much do you think it'll go for?" Nathan asked Tom, trying to keep his voice casual. Tom shrugged. "Hard to say. Most folks today are looking for practical items. That old thing is more sentiment than sense. Could go for a song, could sit here till next week." Nathan nodded, his mind already calculating the slim odds that his single dollar might be enough. But as he watched Emma continue her exploration of the wagon, discovering carved initials hidden beneath layers of grime and pointing excitedly at details only she could see, he realized that some gambles were worth taking regardless of the odds. The afternoon sun slanted through the auction house windows as the bidding began, and Nathan Yoder prepared to spend his last dollar on what might be his last hope. The auction house filled with the familiar sounds of rural commerce, metal folding chairs scraping against concrete floors, the rustle of sale bills being consulted, and the low murmur of neighbors catching up on a week's worth of gossip. Nathan found seats in the back row, positioning himself where he could watch both the auctioneer and Emma, who seemed mesmerized by the entire spectacle. Tom Miller took his position at the podium with the confidence of a man who'd been calling auctions since before some of his bidders were born. His voice carried easily through the building as he started with the smaller items, hand tools, kitchen utensils, a collection of mason jars that sparked spirited bidding among the local women. Emma watched everything with wide eyes, occasionally tugging on Nathan's sleeve to point out something that caught her attention. When a wooden rocking horse came up for bid, she leaned forward with obvious interest, but Nathan had to gently shake his head. The horse sold for $12, 12 times what he had to spend. As the afternoon wore on, Nathan's anxiety grew. The wagon hadn't appeared yet, and with each passing lot, he worried that Tom had decided to hold it for a later sale. Emma seemed to sense his tension, her small hand finding his and squeezing gently, a gesture that reminded him that some things mattered more than money. "Next up," Tom announced, his voice taking on the practiced rhythm that meant business was getting serious. "We have lot 47. This here's an old farm wagon, been sitting in the Hochstetler barn for the better part of 50 years. Now, she needs work. I won't lie to you about that, but there's good bones underneath all that rust and weather." Two men wheeled the wagon to the front of the auction house, and Nathan felt Emma stiffen beside him with excitement. In the afternoon light streaming through the windows, the wagon looked even more battered than it had in the shadows. Paint peeled from its sides like old skin, and the metal hardware showed decades of neglect, but Emma saw past the deterioration to something else entirely. She pointed to the wagon and whispered the first word Nathan had heard her speak in 2 weeks: pretty. Tom started the bidding at $25, a price that might as well have been $2,500 for all the good it did Nathan. He watched as several hands went up around the room, mostly from dealers who might see profit in restoration or farmers who could use the parts. 25, now 30, $30 bid, now 35. The price climbed steadily as Nathan's heart sank. $40, 50, 60. Each raise of a bidder's hand felt like another door closing on Emma's happiness. He looked down at the crumpled dollar bill in his palm, smoothing it out with his thumb, as if that might somehow multiply its value. $75, 75, do I hear 80? The bidding slowed as the price climbed beyond what most considered reasonable for a wagon that needed extensive work. Nathan watched the faces of the remaining bidders, reading the calculations in their expressions, the mental math of cost versus potential return. 75 going once, 75. Going twice, $1. The words came out of Nathan's mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them. A ripple of confused murmurs went through the crowd as heads turned to locate the source of such an unusual bid. Tom Miller paused, his gavel halfway to the lectern. "I'm sorry, Nathan, but the current bid is $75. Are you bidding 76? Nathan stood slowly, feeling every eye in the building upon him. Emma looked up at him with a mixture of confusion and hope that nearly broke his resolve. "No, sir, I'm bidding $1. That's all I have, and I'm offering all of it." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to collapse the roof. Nathan had violated the unspoken rules of auction etiquette, and he could feel the disapproval radiating from some of the other bidders. But he also saw something else in a few faces: understanding, perhaps even respect, for a man willing to risk everything for a child's happiness. Tom Miller had been running auctions long enough to handle unusual situations with grace. "Well, that's certainly an honest bid," he said with a slight smile, "but I'm afraid the current high bid stands at $75. Do I hear 80? The building remained silent. Nathan could see the other bidders glancing at each other, uncertain how to proceed. The moment stretched out like a held breath until finally an elderly woman in the third row spoke up. "Tom, who's got the current high bid?" Tom consulted his notes. "That would be Jake Morrison from over in Paradise Township." Nathan knew Jake, a dealer who bought items at auction and resold them at his antique shop. A good man, but one who saw profit where Nathan saw possibility. The elderly woman turned in her seat to face Jake. "Jake Morrison, you planning to keep the wagon or sell it?" Jake looked uncomfortable under the sudden attention. "Well, I reckon I'd fix it up and find it a good home, Mrs. Beeler." Mrs. Byler, Nathan now recognized her as the widow of one of the community's most respected elders, nodded thoughtfully. "Seems to me it's already found a good home." She stood and addressed the room. "I withdraw my earlier bid. Anyone else feel the same way?" What happened next would be talked about in the community for years to come. One by one, the other bidders withdrew their offers, leaving Jake Morrison holding the high bid alone. Jake looked around the room, reading the faces of his neighbors, understanding the weight of community opinion settling on his shoulders. "Tom," Jake said finally, "I think I'll pass on this lot." Tom Miller had been calling auctions for 30 years, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. He looked out at the crowd, then down at Nathan and Emma, then back at his notes. "Well, that brings us back to Nathan Yoder's bid of $1. Are there any other offers?" The silence stretched out until it became an answer in itself. "Sold to Nathan Yoder for $1. The applause that erupted was unlike anything typically heard at an auction. Emma clapped her hands together with pure joy, her face brighter than Nathan had seen since she'd come to live with him. As neighbors congratulated him and offered help with transporting the wagon, Nathan felt something he hadn't experienced in months: the warm embrace of community support. But it was Jake Morrison's words, spoken quietly as he helped load the wagon onto Nathan's borrowed truck, that would stay with him longest. "Sometimes the best deals aren't about money, Nathan. Sometimes they're about doing what's right." The drive home was filled with Emma's excited chatter, more words than she'd spoken in the previous month combined. She pointed out details she'd noticed on the wagon, made plans for how they might fix it, and asked questions that showed she was finally allowing herself to hope for a future. As they pulled into the farm's gravel driveway, Nathan caught sight of Ruth Miller hanging laundry on the line between their properties. She waved, and he found himself waving back with more enthusiasm than the gesture warranted. There was something about the day's events, the community's support, Emma's renewed spirit, the wagon itself, that made him feel like anything might be possible. They positioned the wagon in the barn, where the afternoon light filtering through the windows seemed to give it a dignity it had lacked in the auction house. Emma immediately began another inspection, her small hands exploring every surface as if she were reading a story written in wood and metal. It was then that Nathan noticed something unusual. Hidden beneath decades of grime and layered paint carved into the wagon's side panel were what looked like initials, JY, followed by symbols that might have been decorative flourishes or might have been something more significant. JY, Nathan murmured, running his finger over the carved letters. In his family, J names were common. His grandfather had been Joseph, his great-grandfather Jacob. Could this wagon have some connection to his own family history? Emma looked up from her exploration of the wagon's interior, pointing to something she'd discovered under a pile of old newspapers. Nathan reached in and pulled out what appeared to be official documents, water-stained and brittle with age. At the top of the first page, in faded but still legible script, he could make out the words "ownership papers." And below that, "Property of Jacob Yoder, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania." Nathan's hands began to shake as the implications sank in. This wasn't just any old wagon. This was a piece of his family's history, a connection to ancestors he'd only heard about in stories. And somehow, impossibly, it had found its way back to them for the price of his last dollar. Emma tugged on his sleeve, pointing to the ownership papers with questioning eyes. Nathan knelt down to her level, his voice filled with wonder as he spoke. "Emma, I think we just brought home more than a wagon. I think we brought home a piece of our family." As the sun set over the fields his great-grandfather Jacob had once worked, Nathan Yoder realized that sometimes the most valuable things in life came disguised as junk, waiting for someone with enough faith to see their true worth. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made everything seem possible. Nathan woke before dawn, as had been his habit for 40 years of farming, but today he felt an anticipation he hadn't experienced since he was Emma's age. The wagon sat in the barn like a wrapped present waiting to be opened, its secrets hidden. Beneath decades of neglect, Emma appeared in the kitchen wearing the same blue dress from yesterday, her hair braided neatly, evidence that she'd made an effort to prepare for what she clearly considered an important day. She ate her breakfast quickly, her eyes constantly drifting toward the window that faced the barn. "Eager to get started?" Nathan asked, smiling at her obvious excitement. Emma nodded enthusiastically, then surprised him by speaking. "Can we make it pretty again?" The question hit him with unexpected force. In those 6 words, she'd captured everything he hoped for. Not just the restoration of an old wagon, but the restoration of beauty and joy in their lives. "We can certainly try," he said, "but it's going to take time and patience. Good things usually do." They gathered their supplies from around the farm, buckets of warm water, scrub brushes, soap, old rags, and a collection of hand tools that had belonged to Nathan's father. Emma insisted on carrying her own small bucket, walking carefully across the yard to avoid spilling a drop. The barn felt different this morning, filled with purpose and possibility. Nathan had positioned the wagon near the large doors where the morning light streamed in, illuminating dust motes that danced around them like tiny spirits blessing their work. "Let's start with washing," Nathan suggested. "Sometimes you can't. See what you're working with until you clean away what doesn't belong." They began with the wagon's exterior, Emma working on the lower sections she could reach, while Nathan tackled the higher areas. As they scrubbed, years of accumulated grime began to dissolve, revealing glimpses of the original wood underneath. It was Emma who made the first significant discovery. As she worked on a section near the wagon's front corner, her scrub brush caught on something raised beneath the layers of paint and dirt. "Nathan, look," she said, pointing to what she'd uncovered. Nathan set down his own brush and knelt beside her. What had seemed like random scratches from a distance revealed themselves to be deliberate carvings when viewed up close. Intricate patterns swirled across the wood, vines and flowers intertwined with symbols that looked almost like letters. "These are beautiful," Nathan murmured, running his finger along the carved lines. "Someone spent a lot of time making these." Emma traced the patterns with her own small finger, her face scrunched in concentration. "Like a story?" "Maybe it is a story," Nathan agreed. "Maybe everything about this wagon is trying to tell us something." As they continued their work, more carvings emerged from beneath the grime. Some were clearly decorative, flowing patterns that reminded Nathan of the Pennsylvania Dutch folk art he'd grown up seeing. But others seemed more personal, more deliberate. It was near the wagon's rear corner that they found the initials Emma had spotted the day before, now clearly visible after their cleaning. J.Y. carved with obvious care, each letter perfectly formed. But beside those initials, revealed only after careful scrubbing, were others. M.R., J.Y. and M.R., Nathan read aloud. Jacob Yoder and someone whose name started with M and R. Emma looked up at him with questioning eyes. Who was Jacob? Nathan settled back on his heels, considering how to explain family history to a 4-year-old. Jacob was my great-great-grandfather. That makes him your great-great-great-grandfather. He lived a very long time ago, maybe 150 years. Did you know him? No, little one. He died long before I was born. But my grandfather used to tell stories about him. He said Jacob was a good man who helped people when they needed it most. Emma nodded solemnly, then returned her attention to the carvings. And M.R.? I don't know, Nathan admitted. But maybe we'll find out. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced a visitor. Nathan looked up to see Ruth Miller approaching the barn, carrying a basket that undoubtedly contained food. Ruth had a habit of showing up whenever she sensed people. Might be hungry, which in Nathan's experience was most of the time. "Morning, Nathan. Hello, Emma, dear," Ruth called out as she entered the barn. She stopped short when she saw the wagon, now partially cleaned and revealing its hidden artistry. My goodness, would you look at that? Ruth was a woman of perhaps 50, with silver threading through brown hair she kept pinned back in the practical style of Amish women. Her face had the kind of beauty that came from years of genuine kindness, and her presence always seemed to bring calm to whatever situation she entered. "We found carvings," Emma announced, the longest sentence Nathan had. "Heard her speak since the accident. Did you now?" Ruth set down her basket and approached the wagon with obvious interest. Her eyes traced the patterns they'd uncovered, pausing at the initials. J.Y. and M.R., she read. "How interesting. You recognize those initials?" Nathan asked, hearing something in a tone that suggested familiarity. Ruth was quiet for a moment, studying the carvings with an expression Nathan couldn't quite read. "The J.Y. makes sense, given that this was Jacob Yoder's wagon," she said finally. "But M.R.?" She paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "In my family, we have stories about an ancestor named Mary Ruth who lived around that time. She would have been Mary Ruth Miller before she married." Nathan felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than coincidence. "Your ancestor and my ancestor?" "It's possible," Ruth said carefully, "though I'd need to check the family records to be certain." She looked at the initials again, then at Nathan with an expression that seemed both hopeful and hesitant. "Would you like me to do some research?" Before Nathan could answer, Emma tugged on Ruth's skirt. "Will you help us make it pretty?" Ruth's face softened as she looked down at the little girl. "Of course I will, sweetheart. I think this old wagon deserves all the help it can get." They worked together for the rest of the morning, the three of them falling into an easy rhythm. Ruth proved to have a gentle touch with the delicate carvings, carefully cleaning around them without damaging the wood. Emma appointed herself the official inspector of their progress, moving around the wagon to examine each newly revealed section. It was Ruth who noticed the first signs that the wagon held more secrets. As she worked on the wagon's bed, her cloth got on a section of flooring that seemed slightly raised compared to the rest. "Nathan, come look at this," she called. Nathan joined her, running his hands over the area she'd indicated. What felt like solid flooring revealed a hairline crack when examined closely, the edge of what might be a hidden compartment. "Should we try to open it?" Ruth asked. Nathan looked at Emma, who was watching them with bright, expectant eyes. "What do you think, Emma? Should we see what's hiding in there?" Emma nodded eagerly, and Nathan couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. Whatever they found, whatever secrets this wagon held, it had already accomplished something remarkable. It had brought hope back into their lives and connected them to a past they'd never known existed. as Nathan carefully worked to open what appeared to be a hidden panel in the wagon floor. He realized that sometimes the most important discoveries came not from seeking, but from simply being open to wonder. And judging by the expression on Emma's face, wonder was something they all needed more of in their lives. The hidden panel resisted Nathan's initial attempts to open it, the wood swollen from decades of moisture and neglect. He worked carefully, not wanting to damage whatever might be preserved inside, while Emma and Ruth watched with the intensity of archaeologists at a dig site. "Easy, does it?" Ruth murmured, her hand resting gently on Emma's shoulder as the little girl leaned forward for a better view. With a soft crack that spoke of long-held secrets finally being released, the panel gave way. Nathan lifted it carefully, revealing a shallow compartment lined with what appeared to be oiled cloth, a preservation technique that spoke to someone's intention that these contents survive the passage of time. Emma was the first to spot the envelope tucked into one corner of the space. "There's something in there," she whispered, her voice filled with the reverence children reserve for truly magical moments. Nathan reached in and withdrew a small packet wrapped in the same oiled cloth. As he carefully unwrapped it, the scent of dried flowers and old paper drifted up, a fragrance that seemed to carry whispers from another century. Inside the cloth, pressed flat and preserved with remarkable care, was a collection of wildflowers. Purple violets, white daisies, yellow buttercups, and delicate baby's breath had been arranged with obvious love and attention. Each flower was accompanied by a small strip of paper with dates written in faded brown ink. "First picnic, May 15th, 1873. The day you said yes, June 2nd, 1873. Our wedding day, September 14th, 1873. Ruth's hand flew to her throat, her eyes wide with recognition and wonder. "Pressed flowers," she breathed. "My grandmother used to do this. Preserve flowers from special occasions. She said it was a way to keep the sweetest. Memories close to your heart." Emma reached out tentatively, then stopped. "Can I touch them?" "Very carefully," Nathan said, understanding her need to connect with these tangible pieces of the past. "They're very old and fragile." Emma's small fingers barely brushed the petals of the white daisy marked "Our Wedding Day." As she did, Nathan noticed tears gathering in Ruth's eyes, though whether they were tears of joy or sorrow, he couldn't tell. "Ruth, are you all right?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, offering a watery smile. "I'm fine. It's just, this is so romantic. To think that someone loved someone else enough to save flowers from their special days and then hide them away like treasure." She paused, studying the dates. 1873. That would make this about the right time for Jacob Yoder and Mary Ruth Miller. Nathan felt something stir in his chest, a connection not just to his own past, but to the woman standing beside him. "Your ancestor kept a record of their courtship." "It appears so," Ruth said softly, "and Jacob helped her preserve it." Emma had moved on to examining the envelope that had shared the compartment with the flowers. It was sealed with old sealing wax that had somehow survived intact, marked with the impression of what looked like a simple cross. "Should we open it?" Nathan asked, though he already knew the answer from the expression on Emma's face. He broke the seal carefully, mindful that they were handling something that had been untouched for over a century. Inside, written in the same careful hand that had labeled the flowers, was a letter. "My dearest Jacob," Nathan read aloud, his voice dropping to the hushed tones appropriate for such an intimate discovery. "By the time you read this, we will be husband and wife, and this wagon will carry us to our new home. I wanted to leave you these words and these flowers as a reminder of how our love grew from the smallest seed into something beautiful and strong." Ruth moved closer, drawn by the romance of the moment, and Nathan found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way she smelled of lavender soap and fresh bread, the way her shoulder almost touched his as they read together. Emma climbed up, into the wagon bed, positioning herself where she could see over Nathan's arm. "Keep reading," she urged. "I know that life will bring us challenges," Nathan continued. "There will be hard winters and failed crops, sickness and sorrow, moments when we question whether love is enough to sustain us. But I want you to remember this collection of flowers, each one marking a moment when joy was stronger than fear, when hope was brighter than doubt. Love is not just a feeling, my dear Jacob. It is a choice we make every day to see beauty in ordinary moments and to build something together that is greater than what either of us could create alone." Nathan's voice caught slightly on the last words, and he realized that Mary Ruth's letter was speaking to more than just historical curiosity. It was speaking to his present circumstances, to the daily choice he made to care for Emma, to the growing awareness that his feelings for Ruth went deeper than neighborly friendship. "There's more," Ruth said gently, pointing to the bottom of the letter. Nathan cleared his throat and continued. "I am hiding this letter and these flowers in our wagon because I want our children and our children's children to know that their story began with love. Someday, perhaps when they face their own challenges, they will find these tokens and remember that love endures, that families are built on small acts of kindness, and that the most precious treasures are not gold or silver, but the memories we create together. With all my love, your devoted wife, Mary Ruth Yoder." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of connection across generations. Emma was the first to speak, her voice small but clear. She was happy. "Yes," Nathan said, carefully folding the letter. "I think she was very happy." Ruth wiped away fresh tears, but these were clearly tears of joy. "To think that this has been hidden here all this time, waiting for the right people to find it. Maybe it found us when we needed it most," Nathan said, looking at Emma and then at Ruth. "Maybe Mary Ruth's words about love being a choice. Maybe we needed to hear that right now." Emma had discovered something else in the compartment, a small drawstring bag that clinked softly when she picked it up. "What's in here?" Nathan opened the bag carefully, revealing a collection of small items, a wooden button carved with intricate designs, a small piece of smooth riverstone, a brass thimble, and what appeared to be a child's toy soldier made of pewter. "Keepsakes," Ruth said, understanding immediately, little treasures that meant something special to them. As they examined each item, Nathan realized that they weren't just uncovering Jacob and Mary Ruth's story. They were writing their own. Emma's healing journey, his growing feelings for Ruth, the sense of family and community that was beginning to form around them. All of it seemed connected to this wagon and its hidden treasures. "Emma," he said softly, "what do you think we should do with these things?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Keep them safe," she said finally, "like they kept them safe for us." Nathan nodded, understanding that they had become the stewards of more than just objects. They were now the guardians of a love story that had waited over a century for its next chapter to be written. The discovery of the pressed flowers and Mary Ruth's letter had changed something fundamental in the atmosphere around the wagon. What had begun as a simple restoration project now felt like a sacred trust. They were not just fixing an old wagon, they were preserving a love story that had waited over a century to be told. Nathan found himself thinking about Mary Ruth's words as he worked alongside Emma and Ruth over the following days. "Love is a choice we make every day," she had written, and those words seemed to echo in every interaction between him and Ruth. In every moment of care he showed Emma, in every decision to keep fighting for their future together. Emma's transformation was becoming more remarkable with each passing day. She chatted constantly now as they worked, asking questions about everything from how wood grain formed to why people carved initials in trees. Her selective mutism seemed to be melting away like frost in spring sunshine, replaced by an insatiable curiosity about the world around her. "Nathan, why did Jacob and Mary Ruth hide their things in the wagon?" Emma asked one morning as she carefully polished the brass hardware they'd discovered under layers of rust. "Maybe they wanted to keep their most precious memories somewhere safe," Nathan replied, watching Ruth sort through the collection of genealogy books she'd brought from home. "Sometimes people hide treasures, not because they're worth money, but because they're worth remembering." Ruth looked up from a thick volume bound in cracked leather. "I've been researching all night," she said, excitement evident in her voice, "and I found something remarkable." She opened the book to a page marked with a ribbon. "Look at this." Nathan and Emma gathered around as Ruth pointed to a family tree, hand-drawn in faded ink. "This is the Miller family genealogy, going back to when we first came to Lancaster County. And here," she pointed to an entry dated 1873, "is Mary, Ruth Miller, married to Jacob Yoder on September 14th. Nathan felt his breath catch. "The same date as the pressed flowers." "Exactly. But that's not all." Ruth turned several pages. "According to this, Mary, Ruth, and Jacob had 4 children, but only one lived to adulthood, a son named Joseph." "Joseph," Nathan repeated. "That was my great-grandfather's name." Emma looked back and forth between them, processing the implications. "So, we're all related?" "Not exactly," Ruth said gently. "But our families were connected a long time ago. Mary Ruth Miller became Mary Ruth Yoder when she married Jacob. I'm descended from her brother William Miller." Nathan felt something shift inside him, a sense of rightness that went beyond mere coincidence. So when Jacob carved those initials, JY and MR, he was marking the wagon that would carry his bride to their new home. "And somehow," Ruth added, her voice soft with wonder, "that wagon has brought us together." The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Emma, with the directness that only children possess, voiced what the adults were thinking. "Are you going to get married too?" Nathan felt heat rise in his cheeks, while Ruth's hand flew to her throat in surprise. The question was innocent enough, but it forced them to confront feelings that had been growing stronger with each shared moment over the wagon. "Emma," Nathan said carefully, "sometimes grown-ups need time to figure out their feelings." But Emma was not easily deterred. Mary Ruth didn't need time. She saved flowers from their first picnic. Ruth laughed, a sound like silver bells that made Nathan's chest tight with longing. "You're very observant, Emma, but every love story is different." As if summoned by the mention of love and marriage, Bishop Samuel's buggy appeared in the driveway. Emma immediately tensed. The child had developed an instinct for recognizing when adult conversations might threaten her sense of security. Samuel approached the barn with his usual measured pace, but Nathan could see disapproval in the set of his shoulders. The bishop's eyes took in the scene. Nathan and Ruth working closely together, Emma settled comfortably between them, the obvious intimacy of their shared project. "Good morning," Samuel said, his tone neutral but carrying undertones that suggested this was not a social visit. "I hope I'm not interrupting important work." "Not at all," Nathan replied, though he felt Emma move closer to his side. "We've been learning about the wagon's history. It turns out it belonged to my great-great-grandfather Jacob." Samuel's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so? And what has this historical research revealed?" Ruth stepped forward, her genealogy book still open in her hands. "We've discovered that Jacob Yoder and my ancestor Mary Ruth Miller were married in 1873. This wagon was likely their wedding wagon." "Interesting," Samuel said, though his tone suggested he found it more problematic than fascinating. "And this discovery has brought you together how many days each week?" The question was pointed, and Nathan felt his jaw tighten. In their community, unmarried men and women spending time alone together was discouraged, even when their intentions were honorable. "We're restoring a piece of family history," Nathan said carefully. "Emma enjoys the work, and Ruth has been kind. Enough to help with the research." "I'm sure she has," Samuel replied, But perhaps it would be wise to consider how such frequent collaboration might appear to others in the community. Emma's small hand slipped into Nathan's, and he felt her tremble slightly. The child's fear of losing another home, another family, was never far from the surface. "Bishop," Ruth said, her voice respectful but firm, "I believe God has brought this wagon back to Nathan's family for a reason. The history we're uncovering, the healing that Emma is experiencing, surely these are good things." Samuel's expression softened slightly as he looked at Emma. "The child's well-being is certainly important, but so is maintaining proper conduct within our community." It was then that Nathan made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Looking at Emma's frightened face, at Ruth's determined expression, at the wagon that had somehow brought them all together, he felt Mary Ruth's words echo in his mind. "Love is a choice we make every day." "Samuel," he said quietly, "I understand your concerns, but this wagon and its history have given Emma hope for the first time since her parents died. Ruth's research has helped us understand our family's past. And if I'm being honest, Ruth herself has brought light into our lives when we desperately needed it." Samuel studied Nathan's face carefully. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Nathan took a deep breath, aware that his next words would change everything. "I'm saying that Mary Ruth Miller chose to love Jacob Yoder over a century ago, and their choice created a family that lasted for generations. Maybe it's time for their descendants to make the same choice." Ruth's sharp intake of breath was audible, and Nathan felt Emma's hand tighten in his. Samuel looked from Nathan to Ruth, reading the emotions in their faces. "Well," the bishop said finally, "I suppose some traditions are worth preserving." He paused, then added with the hint of a smile, "even if they require proper courtship and community approval." As Samuel's buggy disappeared down the lane, Nathan realized that the wagon had done more than preserve a love story from the past. It had given them permission to write their own. The days following Nathan's declaration too, Bishop Samuel carried a new energy, as if the very air around the farm had been charged with possibility. Emma seemed to sense the shift in dynamics between the adults, her eyes bright with curiosity, as she watched Nathan and Ruth navigate their newly acknowledged feelings with the careful politeness of people trying not to rush something precious. It was during their fourth day of deeper restoration work that Emma made the discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about Jacob and Mary Ruth's story. She had been exploring the wagon's interior with the thoroughness that only children bring to such investigations when her small fingers found an irregularity in what appeared to be solid wood. "There's something funny here," she announced, pressing against a section of the wagon's side panel that gave slightly under pressure. Nathan and Ruth immediately stopped their own work to investigate. What Emma had found was another hidden compartment, this one concealed so cleverly that it had escaped their previous searches. The panel slid sideways rather than lifting up, revealing a space that had been custom-built to hold something specific. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and tied with a faded blue ribbon, was a bundle of letters. The package was thick, perhaps 20 or 30 sheets of paper, and had clearly been handled with great care over many years before being hidden away. "More letters," Ruth breathed, her hands trembling slightly as Nathan lifted the bundle from its hiding place. Emma bounced, on her toes with excitement. "Can we read them, please?" Nathan looked at Ruth, seeking her permission as much as her opinion. These letters represented the most intimate thoughts of her ancestor, and he didn't want to presume. "I think Mary Ruth and Jacob would want their story to be told," Ruth said softly, "especially if it can help other people understand what love really means." Nathan untied the ribbon carefully, aware that he was handling something that had been bound by Jacob's own hands. The first letter was dated May 10, 1873, just 5 days before the pressed violet marked First Picnic. My dearest Mary Ruth, Nathan read aloud, his voice carrying across the barn like a bridge between centuries. I have been thinking of you every moment since we spoke yesterday by the creek. When you smiled at me, I felt as though the sun had decided to shine just for us. I know that our families have their concerns, the Millers and the Yoders have, not always seen eye to eye on matters of farming and faith, but I believe that God has brought us together for a purpose greater than our family histories. Ruth's hand moved to her throat, and Nathan noticed tears gathering in her eyes. He faced opposition too, she whispered. Just like us, Emma said matter-of-factly, having picked up on the adult tensions even when the grown-ups thought they were being subtle. Nathan continued reading. I must be honest with you about my circumstances. My father has given me 40 acres of good land, but the house needs work, and the fields require more hands than I possess. I am not wealthy, and I cannot promise you an easy life. But I can promise you that every day we spend together, I will choose to love you more than I did the day before. I will work to build something worthy of your faith in me. The parallels to their own situation were unmistakable. Nathan's financial struggles, the community's mixed feelings about his relationship with Ruth, even Emma's presence as a catalyst for bringing them together. It was as if Jacob and Mary Ruth's story was providing a roadmap for their own journey. Ruth reached for the next letter, dated several weeks later. Her voice was soft but clear as she read Mary Ruth's response. My beloved Jacob, your honesty touches my heart more than any promise of wealth ever could. I do not need luxury. I need a man who understands that love is built through daily choices, through standing together when times are difficult, through finding joy in simple moments. Emma had settled herself cross-legged on the barn floor, listening with the rapt attention she usually reserved for bedtime stories. She sounds like you, Ruth, she said innocently. Ruth blushed but continued reading. My family does indeed have concerns about our union. Father believes the Yoders are too progressive in their thinking, while Mother worries that I'm too young to understand the burdens of farm life. But I have watched my parents' marriage for 18 years, and I know the difference between duty and devotion. What I feel for you, Jacob, is devotion. Nathan felt something loosen in his chest as he listened to Mary Ruth's words. The fears and obstacles they faced weren't unique to their time. People had been choosing love over convenience, hope over fear, faith over certainty for generations. The next letter revealed a crisis that made Nathan's heart race with recognition. Mary Ruth wrote of a failed harvest, of her father's debts threatening the family farm, of pressure from the community to marry a wealthier man who could provide security for both families. I will not lie to you, my darling, Mary Ruth's letter continued in Ruth's gentle voice. There are moments when doubt creeps into my heart like frost on a warm day. When I see the worry in my parents' faces, when I hear whispers from neighbors about our foolish romance, when I calculate the practical challenges we will face, in those moments, I question whether love is enough. Nathan found himself holding his breath, waiting for Mary Ruth's conclusion. But then I remember the feeling of your hand in mine, the sound of your laugh when I tell you my dreams, the way you listen to my thoughts as if they matter as much as your own. And I realize that the question is not whether love is enough. The question is whether we are brave enough to choose love even when it's difficult. Ruth's voice caught on the final words, and Nathan saw tears streaming down her cheeks. Emma noticed too, and immediately moved to comfort her, patting Ruth's arm with the gentle concern that had become characteristic of the healing child. Don't be sad, Emma said. They got married, remember. The flowers said so. Ruth laughed through her tears. You're right, sweetheart. They did get married, and according to my genealogy research, they were very happy together. Nathan carefully gathered the letters they'd read. but he could see there were many more in the bundle. "Should we save the rest for tomorrow?" he asked. "This feels like something we should savor, not rush through." Emma nodded seriously. Good stories should last a long time. As they carefully rewrapped the letters and secured them in the wagon, Nathan found himself thinking about the courage it must have taken for Jacob and Mary Ruth to choose each other, despite the obstacles they faced. Their letters weren't just historical documents. They were evidence that love had always required bravery, that building a life together had always meant taking risks. That evening, as Ruth gathered her things to return home, she paused at the barn door and looked back at Nathan with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of both past and future. "Nathan," she said quietly, "do you think we're brave enough?" Nathan looked at Emma, who was adding final touches to a drawing she'd been working on, a picture of Jacob and Mary Ruth standing beside their wagon, surrounded by the flowers from their collection. Then he looked at Ruth, seeing in her face the same mixture of hope and determination that must have sustained their ancestors through their own challenges. "With God's help," he said, "I think we are." The revelation came on a Tuesday morning when Emma's curiosity led her to investigate what appeared to be a simple repair issue with the wagon's floor. She had been examining the area where they'd first found the hidden compartment when she noticed that one section of the wooden planking sounded different when tapped, hollow rather than solid. "Nathan, this sounds funny," she called out, continuing to tap the board with a small hammer from their tool collection. Nathan had been working on restoring the wagon's iron wheels, his hands black with rust and oil, when Emma's observation made him pause. Ruth, who had arrived early with fresh bread and coffee, set down her basket and joined them around the wagon. "Let me listen," Nathan said, taking the hammer from Emma and tapping the board systematically. The difference was unmistakable, while most of the wagon floor gave off the solid thunk of thick wood. This particular section echoed with the hollow ring of a false bottom. "Another hiding place?" Ruth asked, her voice filled with the excitement that had become familiar whenever they discovered something new about Jacob and Mary Ruth's wagon. Working together, they managed to pry up the false bottom, revealing a cavity that was larger and more elaborate than any they'd found before. This wasn't just a hiding place for love letters and pressed flowers. This was a deliberate concealment, built with the kind of precision that suggested it had been designed for something important. Inside the cavity, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas and leather, was a collection of documents that made Nathan's hands shake as he lifted them out. Even before unwrapping them, he could see that these papers were official, the kind of thick, formal documents that changed people's lives. "What is it?" Emma asked, sensing the gravity of the moment from the expressions on the adults' faces. Nathan carefully unwrapped the outer layers, revealing a deed written in the formal language of 19th century legal documents. At the top, in elaborate script, were the words "Land Grant," followed by "Commonwealth of Pennsylvania," and a date, October 15th, 1872. Ruth leaned closer, her eyes scanning the dense text. "This is a property deed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan's eyes found the crucial line. "To Jacob Yoder, his heirs and assigns forever, the following described tract of land in Lancaster County." What followed was a detailed description of boundaries that made Nathan's heart race with recognition. "Emma," he said quietly, "go get the papers from the kitchen table, the ones from the bank about the foreclosure." Emma ran to the house and returned with a folder of documents that Nathan had been trying not to think about. He spread the bank's survey map on the wagon bed next to Jacob's deed, comparing the boundary descriptions with growing amazement. "Ruth, look at this," he said, his finger tracing the property lines described in Jacob's deed. "The eastern boundary, from the large oak tree by the creek, south along the stone fence to the crossroads. That stone fence is still there. I've walked along it hundreds of times." Ruth studied both documents, her understanding growing as she compared the descriptions. Nathan, this deed describes more land than what the bank thinks they're foreclosing on. 30 acres more, Nathan confirmed, his voice tight with implications he was still processing. According to this deed, Jacob owned not just the 40 acres my family has been farming, but also the 30 acres on the eastern side that includes the creek bottom and the oak grove. The significance hit them all at once. If Jacob's deed was legitimate and the elaborate hiding place suggested it was precious enough to be authentic, then the bank was attempting to foreclose on land they had no legal right to claim. But how is that possible? Ruth asked. Surely, the bank would have verified the property boundaries before approving the original mortgage. Nathan was already thinking through the implications, his mind working with the clarity that came from desperate hope. When my father took out the mortgage 20 years ago, he probably used the same boundary descriptions that had been passed down through the family. If someone along the way lost track of Jacob's original deed, the family might have been farming less land than they actually owned. Emma, who had been listening with the intense concentration she brought to all adult conversations that might affect her security, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. Does this mean we don't have to leave? Nathan looked at the deed in his hands, then at Emma's hopeful face, then at Ruth's expression of growing excitement and understanding. It might mean exactly that, he said carefully, but we'll need to have these documents verified by someone who understands property law. Ruth was already reaching for her genealogy books. I might know someone who can help. My cousin works at the county courthouse. She handles property records. If anyone would know how to verify the authenticity of a deed like this, it would be her. As they carefully re-examined the hidden compartment, Nathan found something else that made his breath catch. A smaller document tucked behind the deed. This one was a letter, but not a love letter. It was addressed to my descendants and signed by Jacob Yoder. My descendants, Nathan read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of words written by a man who had clearly understood he was communicating across generations. If you are reading this letter, then the time has come when our family faces a crisis that threatens our home and our future. I am hiding this deed and these words because I have learned that sometimes the most important inheritances are not the ones written in wills, but the ones hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when they are needed most. Ruth's hand found Nathan's arm, her touch steadying him as he continued reading words that seemed to speak directly to their current situation. The land described in this deed was granted to me not just for my service as a farmer, but for my assistance in helping others find freedom during the dark years when human beings were bought and sold like cattle. This wagon, which carries this deed, also carried precious cargo to safety. Men, women, and children seeking the liberty that should be every person's birthright. Emma's eyes widened as she began to understand the historical significance of what they'd discovered. Jacob helped slaves escape? It sounds like he did, Nathan confirmed, feeling a surge of pride in an ancestor he'd never known. This wagon was part of the Underground Railroad. The letter continued, I pray that my descendants will use this land not just to sustain themselves, but to help others as they are able. Land is not just property, it is opportunity, responsibility, and hope for the future. If you have found this deed, then you have also found the proof that our family has always chosen courage over comfort, service over selfishness. Ruth wiped tears from her eyes. Somehow he knew that his family would need this information someday. But there's more, Nathan said, his voice filled with wonder as he reached the letter's conclusion. He writes, I have hidden gold, coins in this same compartment, payment for my services to the cause of freedom. Use them wisely, not for luxury, but for security and for helping others who lack what you have been blessed to receive." They searched the compartment more thoroughly, and sure enough, wrapped in a small leather pouch that had escaped their initial inspection, were 20 gold coins dating from the 1870s. Each coin was worth more than Nathan made in a month of farming. Emma held one of the coins up to the light, watching it gleam with the warm glow of precious metal. "Is this enough to save the farm?" Nathan looked at the deed, the coins, the wagon that had preserved their family's legacy for over a century, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the solid ground of certainty beneath his feet. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think Jacob just saved all of us." As word of their discovery spread through the community over the following days, Nathan realized that the wagon had done more than preserve his family's past. It had secured their future. But more than that, it had brought together 3 people who needed each other in ways they were only beginning to understand. The foreclosure was no longer a threat hanging over their heads. Instead, it had become the catalyst that led them to discover not just their legal rights to the land, but their emotional rights to happiness, family, and love. The discovery of Jacob's journal 3 days later felt like the final piece of a puzzle that had been waiting over a century to be completed. Emma found it tucked behind a loose board in the wagon's driver's seat, a hiding place so perfectly concealed that it had escaped even their most thorough searches. Unlike the formal deed or the romantic letters, the journal was Jacob's private thoughts, written in a hand that grew more confident as the entries progressed. The leather binding was worn smooth by handling, and some pages bore stains that spoke of candlelight reading during late-night vigils. Nathan opened to the first entry, dated March 15, 1872, and began reading aloud to Ruth and Emma as they gathered around the wagon in the soft morning light. "Today, I received word from Thomas Garrett that 3 souls will be traveling through our county next week, seeking passage to Canada. Mary, Ruth, and I have discussed this at length, and we are both committed to offering what help we can. The wagon I am building will serve 2 purposes: to carry my bride to our new home after our wedding, and to carry others to freedom when the need arises." Ruth's hand covered her mouth as the implications sank in. They planned this together. It wasn't just Jacob's decision. Mary Ruth was part of it from the beginning. Emma, who'd been following the story with the intensity she brought to all tales of adventure, asked, "What's Canada?" "It's a country north of here," Nathan explained gently, "where slavery was illegal. People who were enslaved in America could be free if they could get there." The journal entries that followed painted a vivid picture of courage and commitment. Jacob wrote of building secret compartments not just in the wagon, but in the barn and even the house. He described Mary Ruth's role in preparing food and clothing for travelers, her skill at tending injuries, and her steady calm during moments of danger. April 2nd, 1872, Nathan continued reading. "Mary Ruth shows no fear, even when Deputy Marshal Williams came asking questions about strangers seen in the area. She offered him coffee and pie, while I hid our guests in the root cellar. Her composure saved us all from discovery." Ruth wiped tears from her eyes. She was so brave, they both were. But it was the entry dated June 10th, 1873, just weeks before Jacob and Mary Ruth's wedding, that revealed the full scope of their commitment and sacrifice. "Tonight we learned that the Underground Railroad station in Paradise Township has been discovered. 3 families are in immediate danger, including children no older than our neighbors' little ones. Mary Ruth and I made the decision to use our wedding wagon for one final mission before our marriage. We will carry them ourselves to the station in Chester County, even though it means risking everything we have worked for." Nathan paused, understanding the magnitude of what Jacob was describing. They used their wedding wagon to rescue families. "The same wagon we're sitting in," Emma said with wonder. The journal entry continued with details that made Nathan's hands shake as he read. "If we are caught, I will likely face imprisonment, and Mary Ruth's reputation will be destroyed. Her father might disown her, and our marriage plans could be ruined. But Mary Ruth said something tonight that I will carry in my heart forever. Jacob, if we cannot choose courage when others need us most, then what good is our freedom? What meaning would our love have if we used it only for ourselves?" Ruth was crying openly now, but these were tears of pride and recognition. That's exactly what love should be, something that makes you braver, not more selfish. The mission described in the journal had been successful, but not without cost. Jacob wrote of narrow escapes from slave catchers, of traveling by night through dangerous territory, of Mary Ruth's quick thinking when they encountered a patrol near the Lancaster County line. July 1st, 1873, Nathan read from an entry written clearly in the aftermath of their dangerous mission. "We are safely home, and the families we carried are now beyond the reach of those who would drag them back to bondage. But the experience has changed us both. Mary Ruth says she finally understands what her grandmother meant when she spoke of purposeful love, love that exists not just for its own sake, but to serve something greater than itself." Emma had been listening with rapt attention, and now she asked a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Are we going to help people too?" Nathan looked at Ruth, seeing in her expression the same recognition that was growing in his own heart. The Wagon hadn't just preserved their ancestors' love story, it had preserved their legacy of service and sacrifice. The question now was whether Nathan, Ruth, and Emma were ready to carry that legacy forward. "I think," Ruth said slowly, "that we already are helping people. We're helping each other." But Emma wasn't satisfied with that answer. "What about other people who need homes? Like I needed a home." The simplicity of her question hit Nathan like a physical blow. Emma had experienced firsthand what it meant to lose everything, to depend on the kindness of others for survival. Of course, she would understand the importance of helping people who faced similar struggles. Nathan's mind began working through possibilities. The additional 30 acres they'd discovered could support more than just their family. The gold coins Jacob had hidden could fund improvements that would benefit the entire community, and Ruth's presence in their lives had already shown them that love multiplied when it was shared rather than hoarded. "Emma," he said carefully, "what would you think about sharing our home with other children who need families?" Emma's face lit up with an enthusiasm that answered his question before she spoke. "Like a big family, like a big family," Nathan confirmed, feeling a rightness about the idea that seemed to emanate from the wagon itself. Ruth reached over and took Nathan's hand, her touch sending warmth up his arm and straight to his heart. "The community has been talking about the need for more foster families," she said. "Children like Emma who lose their parents and need temporary homes while relatives are located or adoption arrangements are made." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of an automobile engine, unusual enough in their community to draw everyone's attention. Nathan looked out to see a black sedan pulling into their driveway, followed by Bishop Samuel's buggy. Emma immediately tensed, her old fears surfacing at the sight of official vehicles. Nathan put a protective arm around her shoulders, while Ruth moved closer to his other side. The car's occupant proved to be a middle-aged Englisher woman in a tailored suit, carrying a leather briefcase that suggested serious business. She was accompanied by a younger man with a surveyor's equipment, and Nathan's heart sank as he realized what this visit might mean. Bishop Samuel approached first, his face grave. "Nathan, this is Mrs. Patterson from the county courthouse, and Mr. Reynolds, the county surveyor. They're here about the deed you discovered." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering consequential news. "Mr. Yoder, we've completed our analysis of the documents you submitted. I wanted to discuss our findings with you in person." Nathan felt Ruth's hand tighten in his, while Emma pressed closer to his side. Whatever Mrs. Patterson had to say would determine not just their financial future, but Emma's security and their chance at building the family they'd begun to envision. "The deed you discovered is authentic," Mrs. Patterson began, and Nathan felt his knees go weak with relief. "Our analysis confirms that it was properly executed and recorded in 1872. However, there are some complications we need to discuss." Nathan's relief turned to anxiety. "What kind of complications?" "The boundary descriptions in your ancestor's deed are accurate, and you do indeed own 30 acres more than what's currently being farmed. However, the bank has a legal claim against the property based on the mortgage your father signed 20 years ago. The question becomes whether the additional land value is sufficient to satisfy the debt." Mr. Reynolds consulted his notes. "Based on current land values in Lancaster County, the additional 30 acres are worth approximately $40,000. Your mortgage debt, including accumulated interest and penalties, stands at $37,000. Nathan did the math quickly. "So we would own the land free and clear, with $3,000 left over. Assuming the bank agrees to accept the land value in lieu of cash payment," Mrs. Patterson confirmed. "Which brings us to the more complicated issue." Ruth stepped forward. "What issue?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew more serious. "The bank is claiming that since the mortgage was based on incomplete property descriptions, the entire loan agreement might be invalid. They're threatening to fight the deed's validity in court, which could tie up the property for years." Emma looked up at Nathan with worried eyes. "Does that mean we still have to leave?" Nathan knelt down to Emma's level, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. "No, little one. It means we're going to have to fight to keep what's rightfully ours." Bishop Samuel cleared his throat. "Perhaps this is something the community should discuss. This affects more than just Nathan's family. It affects all of us." Mrs. Patterson nodded. "There will need to be a formal hearing before the county judge. Both sides will present their evidence, and the judge will make a determination about the property's ownership." As the officials prepared to leave, Nathan realized that Jacob's journal had prepared them for exactly this moment. His ancestor had faced the choice between safety and courage, between protecting what was his and fighting for what was right. Jacob and Mary Ruth had chosen courage, even when it meant risking everything they valued. Now it was Nathan's turn to make the same choice. "Mrs. Patterson," he called as she reached her car, "when will this hearing take place?" "2 weeks from today," she replied. "I hope you'll have legal representation." As the official vehicles disappeared down the lane, Nathan looked at the wagon that had brought them to this moment. Inside that weather-beaten wood and metal was a story of love, courage, and sacrifice that had waited over a century to inspire another generation. "Well," Ruth said softly, "I guess we're about to find out if we're as brave as our ancestors." Emma took Nathan's hand and Ruth's hand, linking the three of them together. "We are," she said, with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Jacob's journal said so. The Lancaster County courthouse had stood for over 100 years, its red brick walls witness to countless disputes over land, love, and legacy. On the morning of their hearing, Nathan stood before those same walls with Emma's small hand in, his and Ruth's steady presence at his side, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. Emma wore her best dress, one that Ruth had sewn specially for the occasion in deep blue fabric that made her green eyes shine with determination rather than fear. She clutched a small cloth bag containing one of Jacob's gold coins, which she'd insisted on bringing for luck. Nathan didn't have the heart to tell her that luck would have little to do with what happened in the courtroom today. "Are you ready?" Ruth asked softly, adjusting Emma's collar with the gentle care that had become second nature to her over the past months. Nathan looked down at the leather portfolio containing copies of Jacob's deed, the journal entries, and the supporting documents that Ruth's cousin had helped them prepare. In his other hand, he carried the original ownership papers, the ones that had started this whole journey when they discovered them in the wagon. "I think so," he said, though his voice carried more confidence than he felt. The courtroom was more crowded than Nathan had expected. Word of their case had spread throughout the Amish community, and rows of familiar faces filled the wooden benches behind them. Bishop Samuel sat in the front row, his presence a sign of official community, support that meant more than Nathan could express. Even Jake Morrison, the dealer who had withdrawn his bid at the auction, had come to witness the proceedings. On the opposite side of the courtroom, the bank's representatives sat with their lawyers, 3 men in expensive suits who radiated the confidence of people accustomed to winning such disputes. Their lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Harrison, had a reputation for aggressive tactics that made Nathan's small-town lawyer look inexperienced by comparison. Judge Margaret Kellerman entered the courtroom with the measured pace of someone who had heard every possible variation of human conflict over her 30 years on the bench. She was a woman in her 60s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of matters. "This is a dispute over property boundaries and mortgage obligations," Judge Kellerman began, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom. "Mr. Yoder claims ownership of additional land based on a deed dating from 1872, the First National. Bank disputes both the validity of that deed and Mr. Yoder's right to use it to satisfy his mortgage obligations." Nathan's lawyer, a young man named David Stoltzfus, who was Bishop Samuel's nephew, rose to present their case. His voice was steady despite his obvious nervousness. "Your Honor, we have here an authentic deed executed in 1872, granting Jacob Yoder clear title to 110 acres in Lancaster County. This deed was properly recorded and has never been superseded or invalidated. The plaintiff, Nathan Yoder, is Jacob Yoder's direct descendant and rightful heir to this property." Attorney Harrison rose immediately. "Your Honor, the bank objects to the admission of this so-called deed. There's no proof that this document wasn't forged, and even if authentic, it cannot be used to invalidate a legal mortgage agreement signed 20 years ago." Judge Kellerman examined the deed carefully, her expression giving nothing away. "Mr. Stoltzfus, what evidence do you have of this deed's authenticity?" David stood and called Ruth to the witness stand. Nathan watched as Ruth placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice clear and unwavering despite the magnitude of the moment. "Mrs. Miller, please tell the court about your research into this property's history." Ruth's testimony was thorough and compelling. She described her genealogy research, the family records that documented Jacob and Mary Ruth's marriage, and the historical context that supported the deed's authenticity. She spoke of the Underground Railroad connections, the hiding places in the Wagon, and the consistent pattern of evidence that pointed to Jacob Yoder's ownership of the disputed land. "And in your professional opinion as a genealogy researcher, is this deed authentic?" "Yes," Ruth said firmly. "Every piece of evidence supports its authenticity. The paper, the ink, the legal language, the recording methods, all are consistent with documents from that period." Attorney Harrison's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned Ruth's qualifications, suggested that her personal relationship with Nathan Yoder compromised her objectivity, and argued that genealogy research was not the same as forensic document analysis. But Ruth held her ground with a grace that made Nathan's heart swell with pride. When Harrison suggested that she might have helped forge the document, her response was swift and sharp. "Sir, I have spent my entire adult life preserving family histories and maintaining accurate records. The suggestion that I would fabricate documents is not only false, but deeply insulting to my profession and my character." Judge Kellerman's slight nod suggested that Harrison's aggressive tactics were not working in his favor. The moment everyone had been waiting for came when David called Emma to the witness stand. Nathan's heart nearly stopped as his 4-year-old niece walked to the front of the courtroom with the composure of someone 3 times her age. "Emma, can you tell the court how you and your uncle Nathan found these documents?" Emma's voice was small but clear as she described finding the wagon at the auction, discovering the hidden compartments, and uncovering the family treasures. Her innocence and obvious honesty created a powerful contrast to the legal maneuvering that had dominated the morning. "Why did you want the wagon so much?" David asked gently. Emma considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Because it looked sad and nobody else wanted it. And because Nathan said sometimes good things come disguised as junk." A ripple of gentle laughter went through the courtroom, and Nathan saw Judge Kellerman's stern expression soften slightly. "Emma, do you believe the things you found in the wagon really belong to your family?" Emma nodded emphatically. "Jacob wrote a letter to us. He said if we found it, we needed it." Harrison rose to object, but Judge Kellerman waved him down. "I think we've heard enough for this morning. We'll recess for lunch and reconvene at 2 o'clock for closing arguments." As the courtroom emptied, Nathan pulled Emma into a fierce hug, overwhelmed by her courage and simple wisdom. Whatever happened next, he knew that they had told their truth with dignity and honor, just as Jacob and Mary Ruth would have wanted. The afternoon session began with a surprise that changed everything. As Judge Kellerman called the court to order, the bailiff announced an unexpected witness, Mrs. Eleanor Hochstetler, the 93-year-old widow whose family had owned the barn where the wagon had been stored for 50 years. Mrs. Hochstetler entered the courtroom with the aid of a walker, her aged frame bent, but her eyes sharp with the clarity that sometimes comes to those who have lived long enough to see patterns repeat across generations. Nathan had no idea why she was there, but her presence commanded immediate respect from everyone in the room. "Your Honor," David Stoltzfus said, rising with obvious surprise, "Mrs. Hochstetler has information relevant to this case that only came to light during the lunch recess." Judge Kellerman nodded for the elderly woman to be sworn in, her voice gentle but clear as she took the oath. Attorney Harrison looked frustrated by this unexpected development, but could do nothing to prevent testimony that might be crucial. "To the case, Mrs. Hochstetler," David began, "can you tell the court about your family's connection to the wagon that's central to this dispute?" The old woman's voice was soft, but carried easily through the silent courtroom. "My grandfather, William Hochstetler, helped Jacob Yoder build that wagon in 1872. I grew up hearing stories about it, about how it was made special with hidden places for folks traveling the Underground Railroad." Nathan felt his breath catch. This was independent confirmation of everything they'd discovered in Jacob's journal. "Did your grandfather ever mention the documents that Jacob hid in the wagon?" Mrs. Hochstetler nodded slowly. "Oh yes, Grandpa. Said Jacob asked him to be a witness when he hid the deed and the gold. Said Jacob was worried that someday his family might need proof of what they owned, especially the creek bottom land that had the best water rights in the county." Harrison jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay testimony about events that allegedly occurred over a century ago." Judge Kellerman considered the objection carefully. "I'll allow it. This appears to be testimony about family, oral history, which has recognized value in property disputes involving historical documents," Mrs. Hochstetler continued, her memory surprisingly sharp for someone her age. "Grandpa also said Jacob told him something else, that the wagon would find its way back to the Yoder family when they needed it most. Said Jacob had that kind of faith in divine providence." Emma, who had been listening with wide eyes, suddenly stood up in the gallery. "That's what happened. The wagon found us." Judge Kellerman's stern expression softened into what might have been a smile. "Young lady, you'll need to remain seated unless you're called as a witness." Emma sat down quickly, but her outburst had crystallized something in the courtroom, the sense that they were witnessing more than just a legal dispute, but the fulfillment of a promise made over a century ago. David called one final witness, Dr. Patricia Weaver, a document expert from the State University who had examined Jacob's deed during the lunch break. Her testimony was technical but devastating to the bank's case. The paper, ink, and writing. Implementations are all consistent with documents from the 1870s, Dr. Weaver testified. The legal language matches other deeds from that period, and the recording methods are authentic. In my professional opinion, this deed is genuine. Harrison's closing argument was aggressive, but increasingly desperate. He argued that even if the deed was authentic, it couldn't be used to invalidate a modern mortgage agreement. He suggested that Nathan was trying to use a technicality to escape his legitimate debts. But David's closing argument was simple and powerful. He spoke of Jacob Yoder's foresight in preserving the deed, of a family's right to their ancestral land, and of the moral obligation to honor the sacrifices made by previous generations. "Your Honor," David concluded, "this isn't about technicalities or legal loopholes. This is about justice. Jacob Yoder bought this land with his service to the cause of human freedom. He preserved the deed because he knew his descendants might someday need it. Nathan Yoder isn't trying to escape his obligations. He's trying to honor them, using the means his ancestor provided." Judge Kellerman retired to her chambers for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. When she returned, the entire courtroom held its breath. "This case involves the intersection of historical property rights and modern mortgage law," she began. "After reviewing all evidence and testimony, I find that the deed presented by Nathan Yoder is authentic and valid." Nathan felt Ruth's hand squeeze his tightly, while Emma bounced slightly in her seat. "Furthermore," Judge Kellerman continued, "the property described in Jacob Yoder's deed clearly encompasses the disputed 30 acres. The additional land value is sufficient to satisfy the mortgage debt with the bank." The courtroom erupted in applause from the Amish community members, quickly hushed by the bailiff. "However," the judge added, and Nathan's heart skipped, "the bank is entitled to full payment of the mortgage amount. The court orders that the disputed 30 acres be sold, with proceeds going to satisfy the debt. Mr. Yoder will retain clear title to the original 80 acres. It wasn't perfect, but it was a victory. They would keep the farm, keep their home, and have enough left over to begin the new life they'd envisioned." As the gavel fell and the courtroom began to empty, Mrs. Hochstetler approached Nathan with tears in her aged eyes. "Jacob would be proud," she said simply. "That wagon did exactly what he meant it to do." Emma tugged on Nathan's coat. "Can we go home now?" Nathan looked around the courtroom, at Ruth's joyful face, at Emma's bright eyes, at the community members who had supported them through this ordeal. Then he thought of the wagon waiting in their barn, surrounded by the artifacts of a love story that had guided them through their darkest hour. "Yes, little one," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can go home." 6 months later, the wagon sat in a place of honor in the center of the community barn, its restoration complete and its story finally told in full. The November afternoon light streaming through the wide doors illuminated every lovingly restored detail. The intricate carvings that Emma had discovered beneath layers of paint, the brass fittings that Ruth had polished until they gleamed like gold, and the wooden sides that Nathan had sanded and sealed with the patience of a man who understood that some things were worth doing right. But today, the wagon served a purpose that would have made Jacob and Mary Ruth smile with recognition. Decorated with autumn flowers and surrounded by the entire Lancaster County Amish community, it was the centerpiece of Nathan and Ruth's wedding celebration. Emma stood beside the wagon, wearing a dress of deep burgundy that Ruth had sewn with special care, her hair braided with ribbon that matched the flowers adorning the wagon's restored frame. In her hands, she held a small bouquet of the same wildflowers that Mary Ruth had pressed and preserved over a century ago. Violets, daisies, buttercups, and baby's breath that Ruth had cultivated specially for this day. "Are you ready?" Emma asked Ruth, who was making final adjustments to her own simple white dress, a garment that honored Amish tradition while celebrating the joy of the moment. Ruth knelt down to Emma's level, her face radiant with happiness. "I've been ready for this day since the moment I met you and your Uncle Nathan," she said softly. "But I'm especially ready because I know we're going to be a real family now." Emma's smile could have powered the entire community. "And we're going to help other kids who need families too, right?" "That's right, sweetheart. The county has already approved us as foster parents. There are 3 children coming to stay with us next month while their relatives are located." Nathan approached from where he'd been greeting guests, his own face transformed by a contentment that had seemed impossible just months earlier. He wore the traditional black suit of Amish weddings, but his eyes held the same wonder they'd carried since the day Emma had convinced him to spend his last dollar on hope. "Bishop Samuel says it's time," he told Ruth, offering his arm with the old-fashioned courtesy that had charmed her from the beginning. As they walked toward the front of the barn where Bishop Samuel waited with his worn Bible, Nathan caught sight of several familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Hochstetler sat in the front row, her aged eyes bright with joy at witnessing the continuation of a story she'd helped preserve. Jake Morrison had come with his wife, the man who had stepped aside at the auction, now beaming with satisfaction at seeing how his sacrifice had multiplied into blessing. Tom Miller, the auctioneer, stood near the back with tears in his eyes as he remembered the day when community kindness had trumped commercial competition. Even Dr. Weaver, the document expert who had verified Jacob's deed, had driven down from the university to witness what she called the most romantic case study in historical preservation I've ever encountered. But it was the children present that made Emma's heart sing with anticipation. 3 young faces in the crowd belonged to the foster children who would soon join their family. Siblings aged 6, 8, and 10 who had lost their parents in a car accident and needed temporary care while their grandmother recovered from her own injuries sustained in the same crash. Bishop Samuel's words were simple and profound, drawn from the same traditions that had blessed Jacob and Mary Ruth's union in this very community over a century before. He spoke of love as a daily choice, of family as something built through commitment rather than just blood, and of the ways that God's providence worked through ordinary people willing to take extraordinary risks for each other. Nathan Yoder, Bishop Samuel said, his voice carrying the weight of generations, "Do you promise to love Ruth Miller as Jacob loved Mary Ruth, with courage, with purpose, and with the understanding that true love serves something greater than itself?" "I do," Nathan replied, his voice steady and sure. "Ruth Miller, do you promise to love Nathan Yoder as Mary Ruth loved Jacob, with faith, with strength, and with the knowledge that the greatest treasures are the memories we create together?" "I do," Ruth said, her voice clear and joyful. "Then, by the authority vested in me by this community and by God's grace, I pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss they shared was gentle and full of promise, witnessed by a community that had learned through their story that love could indeed conquer seemingly impossible circumstances. As the celebration continued into the evening, Nathan found himself standing alone with the wagon for a moment, running his hand along the restored wood and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. Emma appeared beside him, slipping her small hand into his with the easy affection that had become natural between them. "Uncle Nathan," she said, though soon she would be calling him something different, something that honored their new legal relationship as well as their emotional bond. "Do you think Jacob and Mary Ruth know what happened?" Nathan looked down, At this remarkable child, who had survived tragedy, found hope in a broken wagon, and helped two adults discover that love was indeed worth the risk. "I think they know, Emma. I think they've been watching over us all along." Emma nodded soletely, then asked the question that showed how much she'd grown in wisdom as well as happiness. "What do you think our story will teach the kids who come after us?" Nathan considered the question, looking around at their community, at Ruth dancing with some of the local children, at the wagon that had preserved one love story and inspired another. "I think it will teach them that sometimes the most valuable things in life come disguised as junk, waiting for someone with enough faith to see their true worth." Emma smiled, understanding completely. "Like us." "Like us," Nathan agreed. As the November stars appeared overhead and the celebration continued around them, Nathan Yoder realized that Jacob's promise had been fulfilled in ways the old farmer could never have imagined. The wagon had indeed returned to the Yoder family when they needed it most, bringing with it not just property rights and financial security, but love, family, and the continuation of a legacy built on faith and courage. The restored wagon would remain in the community barn, a testament to the power of hope and the endurance of love across generations. And in years to come, when other families faced their own trials, they would remember the story of Nathan and Emma and Ruth and the miraculous day when a man's last dollar bought more than anyone could have imagined possible.